Choice is the main thing that sets video games apart from their contemporary artistic mediums. While the audience is simply the passive observer when it comes to books or films, video games allow the audience some degree of interaction with the game world, which opens up many unique possibilities that games have been exploring for decades now. But not all interactions with a game's world are created equal. Some choices that games offer their players are totally inconsequential, whereas others can carry a great deal of importance, which greatly depends on how those choices are designed around the rest of the game. Not all choices that a game presents are going to be, or even should be, this important, but introducing such choices into a design can elevate an experience to greatness. For this video, I'm going to go over what makes choices in video games impactful, challenging, and most of all, meaningful. So let's get into that. I'm going to start off by making a distinction between two different types of choice I'll be discussing, which should be a good way to think about the sorts of interesting choices I'll be talking about in this video. This distinction is made between choices that affect a game's gameplay systems and choices that affect a game's narrative, which I'll be calling mechanical choices and narrative choices respectively. Mechanical choice is a far more broad category, as it encompasses more banal interactive elements of a game, like basic player control, as well as more directed, narrow choices, like choosing between stat increases or perks in an RPG. Broadly, these are choices that affect the game from the perspective of its mechanics. Narrative choice is a more narrow category in comparison, which encompasses choices that have an impact on the game's story in various ways. The scale of this impact can range from minor dialogue differences to total storyline upheavals, though I'll be getting more into that difference later. For the time being, I'm going to focus on mechanical choices to illustrate the more mundane side of choice in video games. Depending on how liberal your definition of choice in games is, a simple platformer set in a completely empty environment could be full of choices, since the player has the choice to make certain inputs at certain times that affect their character's position. Although the player has the freedom to make choices, those choices aren't interesting for a number of different reasons that I'll get to shortly. It's also important to note that, although practically all fully released games will offer much more complex interactivity than that example, there are still very good games that don't offer particularly interesting choices. These are usually games that primarily test the player's execution of specific, relatively rigid challenges, more so than their knowledge and decision-making. The experience of overcoming the challenges present in these sorts of games is typically more about testing the player's ability to react to clearly defined obstacles, with those obstacles being specifically designed to allow for some methods while disallowing most others. The experience of learning how to execute those specific routes and strategies is what makes these games so satisfying, and that doesn't rely on introducing the sorts of choices I'll be talking about in this video. So now, let's get into the kinds of choices that are more interesting, which I'll split into three categories. The first sort of choice I'll discuss are impactful choices, which are choices that significantly impact the player's experience with the game. In the bare-bones platformer example, the player technically has the freedom to make choices, but since the game is so simple and limited, the choice of where to go barely impacts any part of the experience. This is the same case for strictly linear games, where the player is forced into a single progression path through both gameplay and story, as the player has no choice in how either part of the game plays out. In comparison, RPGs, and more broadly games that adopt RPG elements, are the prime examples to show how a game's mechanical choices can be impactful. Character building systems specifically are dense webs of choice that can significantly change the trajectory of the game experience across different playthroughs. Within skill systems like those seen in the Fallout games, the player is only given so many skill points at each level up, which means some skills need to be neglected early on so that others can be prioritized. Combat skills can be prioritized out of caution for future combat encounters, though this gives up points that could be used for utility skills that open up otherwise inaccessible paths during quests like speech or repair. Skill tree systems follow a similar pattern. Using points on any given skill has an opportunity cost of being locked out of other options until you can afford another skill, and the optimal strategy in terms of which weapons or abilities to use in any given situation will change depending on which part of your character you chose to invest in previously. Not all forms of character building systems manage to be impactful, but when done right, they can generate a great amount of variation in how the player experiences the gameplay, all within a single game. In terms of narrative choice, impactful choices are rare, but can add a lot to a story's emotional weight by implicating the player and their actions in the events of the narrative. Their rarity arises because designing and constructing a game around choices that will significantly shift the narrative's events will inevitably split development resources across the multiple paths the story can take. Though this cost is unavoidable to some extent, there are ways that it can be mitigated somewhat. For instance, a choice of two events can be given to the player, but in certain stories, the diverging paths of those events can immediately converge after either scene, so long as the status quo is mostly upheld across both choices. An example of this structure is found in Night in the Woods, where the player has the choice of hanging out with either Greg or Bee at the end of some days. Minor dialogue changes are made based on who you hang out with, but after either scene, the following days are largely the same. Not every style of narrative will be able to uphold the status quo so easily, but for games with relatively static stories that are primarily focused on their characters and their interactions with each other, this can be a great way to implement impactful choices. The cost of offering these choices is also lessened the further into the game the choice is offered. Given a totally linear baseline, adding a choice that completely splits the story's events at the very start of the game will essentially halve the length of the game, assuming each path is of equal length and complexity. This is why a common trope in games is the final choice, which is a choice presented at the very end of the game which only affects the ending, though these choices often fail to have the same impact as a similar choice offered earlier. They are relatively simple and cost-free to implement though, since only a very small portion of the game needs to react to the player's choice. An example of a good middle ground is found in the main quests of both Cyberpunk 2077 and its expansion Phantom Liberty, both of which offer choices leading up to the final main quest that significantly alter the events of that final quest as well as the ending, with the player's engagement with the side content also opening up new options that brings more of the story into context with that final choice. However, the most interesting solution to this design problem is found in a game I'll be referring back to throughout the rest of this video, which is The Walking Dead. Although the outline of the plot in this game is oftentimes very linear, the important choices offered to the player primarily affect which characters continue to live, as well as those characters' relationships with each other rather than the events themselves. This means that the events in the narrative can be shifted by the cumulative effects of the player's choices and how they influence the characters, rather than having each choice split off into multiple, entirely separate paths. With the right emotional connection established between the player and the characters, this can feel just as impactful as a choice that more explicitly splits the narrative in two. The Telltale games are also the perfect example to use for the next sort of choice I'd like to talk about, which are challenging choices. These choices are simply those that are well balanced in each option's opportunity cost, or are otherwise conflicting due to factors like uncertainty or player investment in the story, resulting in a choice that's difficult to make. The Telltale formula specifically highlights these sorts of choices by providing a breakdown of what percentage of players picked each option at the end of each episode. This gives us more quantifiable data for how challenging these choices can be, as many of them hover around 50% for either option. Oftentimes, this is because these challenging narrative choices involve questions of morality that are deliberately gray and additionally very messy due to the player's emotional connection to the narrative. The Walking Dead offers specific moral dilemmas like the abandoned but still running car full of food that could feed your starving group, but whose owners could very well return in the future. The Pathologic games force the player to choose their activities during each day wisely, as aimlessly exploring and searching for supplies out of caution for the future is also wasting precious time you could use to save the townsfolk from the plague. On a larger scale, games like Fallout New Vegas allow the player to radically change the political landscape of the game world, as siding with one of the four main factions essentially allows the player to choose what style of governing body they want to control the Mojave. The really interesting thing about these challenging moral choices in video games is that, with the right level of immersion in the game's story, the game can muddy the waters of one's more objective sense of morality by establishing an emotional connection to the player. In the same way that the vast majority of people would find it more difficult to flip the lever in a trolley car case if a person they knew was tied to the second track, players can develop emotional connections to certain characters or other aspects of the story, introducing those messy emotions to their decision-making and creating even more challenging decisions in the process. These connections we develop to certain characters is what makes these choices so powerful, and it's why they're such a staple of these story-heavy games. Up until now, I've been focusing on challenging narrative choices, but mechanical choices can also be quite challenging at times. For instance, in just the same way that character building systems create impactful choices, they also create challenging ones by giving the player limited resources to allocate for each new level and offering options that are similarly enticing. But there's an aspect of decision making that I need to touch on now, since it greatly affects how challenging a choice is, which is information. While the player may have some foresight on repeated playthroughs of a single game, first-time players will make choices with incomplete information, since they don't know what exactly will happen next in terms of challenges. In an RPG, this means they don't know if they need to invest in combat skills regularly to keep up with the game's difficulty, or if they can afford to focus on skills with more utility during quests for a while. The choices that a game presents can greatly vary in difficulty depending on how much information the player has, which can easily make or break the game's design depending on how necessary it is for new players to make the correct choice. Aside from new players being unaware of what events will occur later in the game, they're also likely to be unaware of information that the game doesn't explicitly give them, or in worse cases, where the game gives incorrect information. For an example of a worst-case scenario, there's a perk in Fallout New Vegas called In Shining Armor, which the game states will give a defensive bonus against energy weapons, but due to a bug, the perk actually has no effect. To a new player, this perk may seem like a viable, albeit situational option, but with perfect information, the choice of whether or not to take this perk is practically non-existent. In the vast majority of cases, it's important to give the player accurate information when it comes to mechanical choices like these that deal with finite resources, as well as choices that the player can't easily change their mind on later. This is why it's common for RPGs to include respec systems that allow the player to reallocate their stats for a small price, which primarily helps new players safely experiment with the many options available to them, while also assisting returning players who want to min-max more easily. While information is important to consider for one's initial playthrough of these more so static experiences, it's important to talk about games where even returning players don't have perfect information, which is typically a result of introducing randomness. Many games incorporate random elements, but they're usually limited in scope and only exist to add a slight bit of variation to repeated playthroughs, or otherwise to keep the player uncertain so that they're encouraged to prepare for the worst. In contrast, roguelikes are built around partially or entirely randomly generated environments, with each run following the same general rules, but still providing a unique set of challenges each time. Through this design pattern, roguelikes are able to keep their players in a constant state of imperfect information as each run progresses. This makes the roguelike genre an ideal playground for creating interesting choices that remain fresh no matter how much experience the player has with the game. Though exploring levels thoroughly is typically encouraged in more static experiences, many roguelikes, like the Risk of Rain games, include incentives to move through the environments quickly and efficiently, making the usually uninteresting choice of deciding where to explore next a test of quick decision-making. The structure that roguelikes like Hades take on also introduces choices between different buffs at predetermined intervals, with the challenge arising from deciding which buffs will carry the most synergy with what you found previously, and which will continue to scale in power in the future. There are also roguelikes that strongly emphasize good decision-making over all else, and the best example of this type of roguelike is The Binding of Isaac. The best way to consistently win runs in Isaac is to carefully consider all the different options that every floor offers, and to squeeze every possible advantage you can out of them, which is often referred to as rigging. Choices like foregoing your first devil deal to guarantee an angel deal later, choosing how to use rerolls to maximize their expected value, and saving consumables that can create item pedestals for high-value rooms like secret or angel rooms, all carry a risk and a technically unknowable reward, which makes for both impactful and very challenging choices. This ability to extract success from nearly any situation is what makes Isaac and other roguelikes that take inspiration from it so satisfying to play once you understand the fundamental mechanics and how to rig runs in your favor, as the choices they offer carry a level of depth that can't be replicated in more static experiences. Now that I've gone over both impactful and challenging choices, let's get to the final type of choice I'd like to talk about. This is the type of choice I allude to in the title of this video: meaningful choices. Video games offer many choices that aren't impactful to the overall experience, nor are they particularly difficult choices to make, but that doesn't mean that they contribute nothing to the experience. As long as a choice contributes some level of meaning to the game, it can still be a worthwhile inclusion, which is what I consider to be a meaningful choice. I like to think of impactful and challenging choices as subsets of meaningful choices, as both previously discussed types add to the game's design as well as the narrative for those games that worry about their story. For instance, the major choices in The Walking Dead are impactful and challenging, but they also carry a lot of meaning in the context of the story and its tone. They add to the game's bleak atmosphere and reinforce the themes established narratively by Clementine's loss of innocence and Lee's story of redemption following his checkered past. But if a choice isn't impactful or challenging, how can it be meaningful? One answer to this question is what I'll refer to as false choices. False choices can be considered the opposite of impactful choices. They are choices that have very minor, or in some cases absolutely zero effect, both mechanically and narratively. There are many games that offer choices like this, most often in the form of dialogue trees that quickly converge back to a single main path. While the intent of these minor choices is typically to offer a bit of reactivity to player choice through dialogue between characters, in the right context, these choices can be quite meaningful as well. The perfect example of this is a moment about halfway through Deltarune's second chapter, where the player is given a choice of which party member they want to continue on with. Although it's perfectly reasonable to believe that this would be a very impactful choice, both mechanically and narratively, it actually doesn't matter which option you pick, as the game always forces you to continue to the next part of the game alone. This doesn't mean that the inclusion of this choice is pointless, however, as a core theme of Deltarune's story is that the player's choices don't matter, and how that ties into the narrative's prophecy and the repeated yet uncertain marketing that the game has only one ending. By including false choices, Deltarune reinforces its story's themes through how it disallows the player from affecting change in that story, which allows those false choices to add to the meaning of its story. An offshoot of the false choice is what I'll call the railroading choice, which is a scenario where the game will only meaningfully progress when the player makes a specific mundane choice, usually interacting with a specific character or part of the environment. These choices technically offer the player the option to do nothing, but in order to continue the game, the player has no choice in how the story progresses. These are very common in linear experiences, and although they're usually not very interesting, in the right context, they can be quite meaningful. My favorite example of railroading choice comes from the end of the first act of Night in the Woods, which is the party scene. During the party, although the player is allowed to stall as long as they'd like, the game will not progress unless May drinks more beer. There isn't a real choice here, since the player must choose to drink in order to meaningfully progress the game, despite the game giving the player the small freedom of doing nothing. This inevitably results in May's embarrassing drunken rant at the end of the scene, which emphasizes a sense of powerlessness on the player's part, and in turn emphasizes May's inability to grow past her childlike mindset. Just like all the other characters in the game that try and fail to help her, the player is just another force that is powerless to affect May's behavior, which makes the use of railroading choices in this scene very meaningful. But to go even further than just railroading, it's possible for games to contextualize the most mundane, purely utilitarian choices a player has. There's a specific sort of choice that several notable meta-narratives contextualize within their text, which is the choice of quitting the game. This particular choice is odd among all the other choices I've talked about, since it's not typically a consideration in game design. If anything, players putting down a game before reaching the end is what a designer should want to avoid at all costs, since the designer loses any sort of connection with a player who quits. However, within a self-aware meta-narrative that can directly acknowledge and communicate with the player within the context of its own narrative, this choice can be contextualized within the narrative in a way that isn't feasible with a more traditional narrative. Although the designer likely still aims for the player to continue the game, simply acknowledging the existence of such a choice as a way to prevent something in the game can strengthen the emotional impact of the events within the story. This is most clearly the case in Spec Ops: The Line, a very linear game in which the player is forced to commit atrocities in the pursuit of a pointless goal. While the game already has the appeal of a train wreck you just can't look away from through its traditional narrative elements, it's made even stronger through the game's explicit insistence that this all could have been avoided if the player just stopped playing the game. Simply through acknowledging the existence of a simple, mundane choice and putting that choice into context with the narrative, it can be given meaning and help to contribute to the game's design. Ultimately, like any other aspect of a game's design, choices should be implemented with purpose and intent. They should contribute to a more engaging, thought-provoking, and/or cohesive experience, which is the purpose of thinking about choices in the way I've laid out in this video. Impactful choices force the player to fully engage with the game's choices if they want a specific outcome. Challenging choices force the player to think carefully about the potential ramifications of their decisions. Meaningful choices connect parts of the experience and reinforce existing themes within the game's text. In the right context, and with the right application, each of these types of choice can make for positive inclusions in a game's design. Player choice is the defining feature of video games as a medium, and so long as care is taken to leverage that choice in an interesting way, video games are capable of creating entirely unique and powerful experiences. I'm happy to have highlighted some of my favorite examples here today, but I think there's still a lot of room left to explore, and I hope to see more in the future.